As Paul said, we're going to do things a little differently today. Our guest of honor is going to be interviewed by the host of WBEZ's award-winning weekday news magazine, 48 Hours. Oh, 48-8. Sorry, 848. Sorry. I listen to it, but I don't read very well. Prior to becoming the full-time host of the program, she served as the senior producer of Chicago Matters, the year-long series examining various topics of broad interest to the region. She's originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and she lives in Lakeview. Allison Cuddy. Allison, come on up here. Thank you. And why don't you get your questions, and if you get them up to Betty Lou and she'll get them to Allison, that will be great. Our guest of honor to be interviewed today is the president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. He has served as president just over 2 years. Previously, our guest today served as dean of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service for 13 years. He earned a bachelor's degree from the State University of New York, followed by a master's and doctorate in politics from Brandeis. Our guest today is married to Jennifer Sims. They are the proud parents of a daughter and a son. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Gallucci. Bob?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you to Maggiano's for a delicious lunch, and of course to the City Club for hosting this wonderful event. I was thinking about MacArthur and their offices around the world, and how, you know, they're in Moscow, in Russia, Mexico, in Mexico City, Abuja, in Nigeria, New Delhi, in India. Capital cities, all of them. Of course, your headquarters are here in Chicago, and I thought, isn't that funny that Chicago is the only one of those cities that is not a capital city? But then I remembered, of course, that's only to people who don't live here. With the level of civic pride we have, we're not only a capital city, we're clearly the center of the world. And that doesn't make us blind to the issues that are facing us right now, economic, political. We've got a lot of messes going on, and I'm hoping that we'll hear from Mr. Gallucci his thoughts about the state of affairs in our world. But I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about your background, because like your predecessors at MacArthur Foundation, you bring a long experience in the world of academics. But unlike them, you also have this long government service, over 20 years, primarily at the State Department. You know, you ended as a special envoy looking at the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. You've been a key figure at some of the most pivotal moments in international affairs, negotiating with North Korea, looking at nuclear safety in Russia, overseeing the disarmament of Iraq in the early 90s, and that really sets you off. That makes you distinctive in terms of the experience that you bring to MacArthur. And I wanted to ask you, 2.5 years, just shy of 2.5 years in, halfway through your first term, how is that experience in diplomacy, in world affairs, shaping your time there, shaping what you hope to accomplish at MacArthur?
Allison, I'm going to try to answer that, but first I want to tell you how much I enjoyed the question. Second, I was looking forward to this, but I didn't think that my first feeling would be that I was Lily Tomlin sitting in a chair. Okay, so thank you, City Club, too. Thank you all for coming. As most of you know, the MacArthur Foundation does a lot of grant Can you hear me? I have a feeling I just
cut out.
Just cut out, and it's coming back. The MacArthur Foundation does a lot of grant making in Chicago. It does grant making in various areas across the United States, but we do serious amount of grant making overseas. So if you think about sort of the first and most direct and obvious way in which I might have had on my best day some preparation for this position, I think it is that I spent over 20 years worrying about various issues of international security around the world, and that the MacArthur Foundation has a program in international security, and there's a kind of direct connection there. I mean, I've worked on, as you noted, particularly the problems related to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, and other political military issues that were unconnected to nuclear weapons. Bosnia, for example, peacekeeping in the Sinai. So I feel like that was a direct connection. There was a direct connection to some of the work of the foundation, but I think generally I have been, in a way, preparing for a position of this kind of breadth in terms of a focus on a phrase which I like but not everybody does, and that's the human condition. That I've wanted to have an impact on the improvement of the lives of people around the country and around the world, and then the lives of people even most proximate to me in the city of Chicago. So I think managing, leading, focusing on mission, which is something that I know some of you may believe we do less of than we should, but that's a big thing when one is in government, certainly on political military issues, is to figure out what the mission is and focus on that mission and evaluate your performance against the mission rather than, I would say, this is a little jargony, but input variables. There are lots of things you can do that look good, but they don't, at the end of the day, have the impact on the mission that you're trying to have. And when I'm at MacArthur, I'm thinking about that, and I think that's the best thing I can do, is I can keep a focus on the mission so that if it's housing or violence reduction in Chicago, or if it's maternal mortality reduction overseas, that the measure is what happens to people. And there's a lot of other things we do that we think contribute to that, but that's not the measure. It's the outcome, and that's if you've been working in a political military environment, that's the kind of thing you have to do.
That measure isn't always in play when we think about the big issues of the day. I mean, as you said, you're an enormous and significant figure here in Chicago. I mean, a point of civic pride for people. We can see MacArthur operating in our front and backyards, in the neighborhoods, but also engaging issues that we know are of critical importance to the city: education, violence, housing. Also high on the list of our new mayor, so that puts you in sync in some respect. But that human element is sometimes missing from the ways in which we engage with these bigger issues. And I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about the state of national politics and the state of our national economy, because I don't think there's anyone in this room who isn't concerned about those. And coming from Washington, having spent a number of years there, serving during different administrations, from Reagan, the two Bushes. I'm curious, President Clinton, you know from divided Congresses, you know from controversial presidents. What do you make of this moment of national politics and what we're seeing happening in Washington? Is this a singular moment? Is this a new terrain we've entered, a new level of dysfunction, or is this look like things that you've seen before?
That's I think the right question. I wish I hadn't started it the way you did, because all this focus upon me and Washington, I feel like I just lost the audience here.
He did leave Washington.
So it's the right question, because I think when we were maybe a year and a half ago at the foundation thinking about a basic dysfunction in the country, it was lots of people are writing about it. We need, when we see something that looks important in the foundation, to see whether that there's a place for us in our work. Is not all problems that afflict the human condition are problems that are open to the MacArthur Foundation or any other foundation necessarily. They may be more appropriate for a government or whatever. But this particular one you're talking about, which is broadly and amorphously the condition of the country, we've been thinking about for some while now at the foundation, attempting to do it rigorously the way we like to, bringing together experts, political experts, people who have been watching this country, historians, people who can go to the question the way you framed it, which is, does it always seem like this, or is this truly different now? And I'm persuaded it is truly different now. And let me develop that just a little bit for everybody. We have been, I think, observing, one way to put it is two gaps widening. One gap is a gap between our political institutions, the big ones that are framed in the Constitution, which function according to compromise, a political compromise, and the separation of powers, the division of powers. We have a government that's supposed to work partly by a fragmentation of power and then a compromise in order to produce policy in the interests of everybody. That's structure, that's system. We have a culture, a political culture, which has more and more, and this is a different part, come to shun compromise. In fact, to many people, I suspect in this room, compromise is a bad word. If I were to tell you that I think we ought to negotiate with North Koreans, something I used to do, or negotiate with Iraqis, which I've done, or others, you might say, well, you're going to compromise. And I would say, I said I was going to negotiate. How do you negotiate with that? So you're going to compromise with North Koreans. Are you going to compromise the national security? The word compromise is negative. Domestically, it's negative. Right now, if you are so committed ideologically to a point of view, and you are in an uncompromising way, you will attract a significant portion of our electorate right now. So I would say one of the problems that's different is that issues have been made ideological. They've been made in a way ethical or moral, in a way that prevents or undercuts compromise, giving away something of you want in order to reach a middle position. It's not embraced, and it makes the ability of the government to deal with issues, let me tick a couple off. Climate change, which, forgive me, I believe is real and man-made in some important ways. The healthcare issue, which, whether you take it from a human condition perspective or a fiscal condition, must be dealt with. If you would look at, I would say, the regulation of our financial institutions as another, and one can go on to major issues, K through 12 education in the United States of America. Lots of issues require compromise, and we are not, bless you, as I was sneezing there, require compromise, and it is not, our political system does not embrace that, our political culture does not embrace that. At the same time, and there's another gap I would note, and that is the gap between where our polity is now, that's us, and the complexity of the issues. Issues of the kind I mentioned are not simple. I mean, there's nothing simple about our fiscal future. You could say, look, there are only two variables, income and outgo. What could be simpler? You know, you can either tax or you can cut spending if you got a fiscal problem. Yes, but as soon as you try to get into that, it gets pretty complicated in terms of the impact of these things. But it also gets ethical. These things are shorthanded in a strange and perverse way politically, and that gap between the ability of the polity to deal with those complex issues, I think has only gotten greater over time. And so the political system is incentivized to make these difficult issues ideological in character, to simplify them so that they become moral questions that really can't be compromised. And the polity is not capable right now, I think, of sorting it out. And it's not entirely separate from the K through 12 education issue, which I think is a serious one in this country, in economic terms and in terms of human condition. That's probably more contorted and complex a kind of answer, but for us, we need to, at the foundation, we need to do this kind of analysis to figure out if there are points here where a foundation like ours can make a difference. When we were looking at the fiscal future, we funded the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Administration study, which laid out a series of possible futures of compromises, and that work was very important to more than one commission that was looking at the fiscal future. So we might do something like that. If we're looking at the education issue, we can see a place to stand with respect to the work we do on digital media and learning, and look for the role of civics in that. So I think the situation in the country is worse than it has been. I think it is, in a way, uniquely bad. Yes, I know we fought a civil war, that's been pointed out to me. Maybe it's not quite that bad, but it is, in recent history, bad. And when you look at the Occupy Wall Street activity, and we have some of this here in Chicago and other cities, it is amorphous, I understand that, but I think people are responding to a real dissatisfaction with an overall political system which embraces our economy. And it behooves all of us, whatever positions we're in, if we're just voters on the one hand, or if you're in a position of political authority on the other, in the interest of this country, in the interest of its people, to try to figure our way through this, get an analysis correct, and then look at prescriptions.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about precisely that, because we're seeing grassroots movements around the world that are very critical of government and whether government is effective, whether it serves the people. And we're seeing that here in the United States, and locally, as you said, we have the Tea Party, who is deeply skeptical about how government operates. And then we have these Occupy movements who feel like corporate interests have taken over government. And I'm curious, I mean, given that you're saying that in some ways the stalemate we're seeing at the national level is driven by ideology, and yet you have these kinds of analyses coming out of these movements that suggest there is a polity that is engaged, there is a polity that is trying to work its way through, or at least point to those kinds of complex issues you're talking about. I mean, what do you make of the critiques that are coming out of those movements?
First, the normal kind of caution you'd expect from me, which is these are all different, right? I don't want to connect the Arab Spring necessarily to what's happening in New York City at the moment, or what's happening in Chicago, and I'm not at all sure I want to connect that activity to the Tea Party. I mean, I think in in all cases they're connected to dissatisfaction, but I would say careful on that point. And
dissatisfaction with systems, some of which has to do with the governing powers and sort of whose interests they serve. But you're right. There are deep differences there as well.
So first, yeah, except the way you have just, that's fine, the way you've just restated it. But the second point for me is that if you took maybe some who are willing to speak, who are part of these demonstrations, or Tea Party folks who now are elected in the Congress, I think you would find an ideological simplicity which is guiding the kinds of things they're likely to say. That simplicity is not necessarily useful to trying to figure our way forward. If you believe, as I do, that the country actually, the people of the country, are much more diverse in their attitudes, and there is still a middle in the United States of America among the electorate, but the middle is not terribly well represented in the House of Representatives, that can be a structural problem, and I think it is. And I think that can explain a little bit of the gridlock. I think we would not be doing justice to the importance of media. I'm cautious, I see Jack staring at me here, but to understand the role of the media in capturing these ideological and sometimes oversimplifications of complex problems. So I'm not of the view that simply caring a lot is the chief measure. I think one can care a lot and become passionate and look for simple solutions, and very bad things can happen. And what I'm looking for is for voters, citizens, to be as well educated as they can, not only about the system, but on the substance of issues. I'm looking to raise the level of discourse on whatever issue you would want to talk about, whether it's a health issue, a security issue, a safety issue, a human condition issue, to have that discussion be as rational, as evidence-driven as it can possibly be. And passion is useful, but it's not a substitute for that.
I want to come back to this issue of sort of thinking about where government works, where it doesn't, where you might intervene either on your own or in concert with collaboration with for-profit or nonprofit organizations. But let's move locally into a question from the audience. And again, please pass your pages forward. Thank you. And this comes from Diana Nelson, and you've invoked education a number of times already, and her affiliation is retired. She said, I was sorry MacArthur gave up on Chicago school reform and focused on brain science. How is that going? Very diplomatic. You could appreciate the form of that question, I think.
Not only have I stopped beating my wife, I never have beat my wife. I would begin with au contraire. We are very much involved, I think, in education reform effort. We can be involved in lots of things in different ways. The foundation, before I got there, went through a period of, I would say, an effort at, put this in quotes, traditional educational reform. We then, again, starting before I came to the foundation, began to study the way young people were learning these days. And it seemed that the way kids were learning was substantially impacted by digital media of all kinds. And that there was an insight to be drawn from that, and the starting insight was maybe if we understood better how kids learned these days, we could translate that insight into learning environments which are quite different than we traditionally understand. And the first thing we noticed was that learning was happening in a lot more places than before. And to think of, let's just look at schools, was to think narrowly and uncreatively. That kids were engaging in a lot of reading, in a lot of variety of writing. They were playing complex games. They were interested by this. They networked with their friends. The whole way in which kids were approaching learning was a more interesting way than schools were generally attempting to teach kids. So the foundation's work in digital media and learning has gone in a direction of trying to develop those insights into ways in which we could ultimately improve K through 12 education. We have started, as one should with this kind of enterprise, small, because one will make mistakes when you're doing something new, and it's better to make small mistakes than big mistakes. And we have before we opened the school, which we did just last month, charter school here, a Quest to Learn school in Chicago, in Cabrini Green on the edge of Old Town. We have, for a couple of years, been using this digital media in a Quest school in New York City, learned some things, are integrating them into the work here in Chicago. We are working with the library with a wonderful U-Media program, which the public school children of Chicago have access to and are using, and is leading to a great deal greater use of books than we've experienced before. The number that I've seen is 700% increase, which seems incredible to me, but Mary seems to be nodding affirmatively. So we think we're onto something. We have been trying to take advantage of this digital media to network the kids to the cultural and educational institutions, the museums of the city and other cultural entities, the zoos, so that we can wire them to these sources of education, a new kind of way of doing things. Overall, not to drive anybody screaming from the room, but the approach is largely through games, but the games are, I should put in quotes, these are designed to take advantage of what the way in which kids learn, which is really by being challenged to understand an entire system approach, so you get more systems learning. And if the games are well designed, and that's what, of course, we're working on, you can, we think, make tremendous leaps, both during the school day, after school, during the summer, and learning can go on in a much more robust way than we traditionally think about it. So I'm trying to persuade you, we're not giving up on education. One way I like to put it, again, which might drive people from the room, I don't want us to be waiting for Superman. For those of you who loved that movie, that's fine, but there's an insight there, which is that great teachers are wonderful. And I couldn't agree more. If I went around the room and said, who's the best teacher you ever had in your life, even if you did go on to graduate school, you'd probably name someone who taught you in K through 12. We know how important that is. Right? I would name someone I had. Sister Scholastica, really, terrific. But we can't wait for Sister Scholastica, and we can't wait for Superman. And what we are trying to do is have an impact. Instead of a slope, think step function. If this digital media and learning area of work is as successful as I hope it will be, we'll have an extraordinary impact on the reform of K through 12 education. And we are investing in it, and we haven't given it up by a long shot.
Here's a question from Kathy Miller from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. African American male unemployment in Illinois is at 21.9%. White male unemployment in Illinois is at 10.2%. This is tied to education, affects violence, welfare expenditures. How is MacArthur addressing this? So, I mean, that's certainly a concern within school reform, right? Are we preparing all students equally to meet the challenges that you're going to lay out for them? But this has to do with the broader.
Yeah.
Are we meeting the needs of everyone here?
Clearly not.
Yeah.
It's a short answer. I heard the mayor recently talking about the unemployment rate, and I don't know whether these were Chicago or the metro area generally, but the percentages about unemployed was correct. But he had two other figures which are useful. Take the average 15% unemployment, or however that averages out to, and then take 100,000 jobs unfilled in this area, and then take the number $200 million, the amount spent on what is supposed to be education in order to prepare people for these jobs. Clearly this is not working.
So what can you do? What can
Yeah.
MacArthur do?
Well, I mean, first I wanted to underline the thrust of the question, which I think is on point. It's a very good question. I mean, our approach to this, particularly in the last few years, has been, this will overuse the word, but more systemic and more comprehensive. This being the building of communities, and that we believe that will be helpful. And that means we are working on things like housing, and infrastructure, and bringing business to neighborhoods, and then also in neighborhoods working on people. So it's just not only the places they are, but the people. So we're working on the education of people, we're working on health issues, we're working on issues, on a question of getting people ready for a work environment, and also in improving the environment where they live, and believe that will create a stronger community. I think as we go forward, it is particularly in the economy we now have, we have to recognize that there's a connection between the less than high quality K through 12 education and the hollowing out of the middle class all across the country. You undoubtedly are aware of the hyper-concentration of wealth in the United States, and in not only the top 10%, the top 1%, but in the top tenth of 1%. And if you look at over the last 20 or 30 years, what's happened to the middle class, it has substantially shrunk. And I think it will be important to figure out ways of educating our youth who are coming up for the kinds of jobs that are available. It will be important to have the curriculum influenced by the people who actually have the jobs, so that these youth have some place to be employed. It will be important to make sure that the junior college performs the role it is supposed to perform, and at a high quality. I think there's a lot of work for us to do here. There's a lot of work for a lot of people to do. The question is right on point, but I don't think there's any simple answer.
Can you talk about a way you could intervene? Because we are at this moment, I mean, budget meetings, hearings are going on right now as we talk in the city, and services that could sort of address those gaps from libraries to community health centers are really on the line. What kind of intervention can an organization, should an organization like yours make?
Yeah, I want to say that the investment that the foundation makes, and I want to talk about MacArthur here just to start, but we're not alone here. You were introduced to other foundation presidents which are here among us, and we participate along with businesses and along with the city government in addressing these problems. But we have our investing in the culture of this city and in communities, and we have had a history of substantial investment. What I was trying to describe is an effort that we believe is the most effective, which is a comprehensive approach to a community rather than focusing on one variable or another variable. I think we are at a particular point in time when we have a particular gap between the preparation of our graduates, of our young people, for the jobs that are available. And addressing that gap, I think, ought to be on all our minds. I think we are trying to do it, focusing particularly on education. The mayor, when I heard him that evening, which was fairly recently, talked about bringing the industry in to help design curriculum, which sounded to me like a pretty intelligent idea.
Why?
I beg your pardon?
Why? Why is that an intelligent idea?
Well, if you believe that Chicago is known for a couple of things, many things, I'm sure. One of them is a transportation hub. And so the airline industry is probably going to hire people in this place. Right? This can't be outsourced to South Asia. So, okay, let's find out if the airline industry has jobs, and it does, what they need, and let's make sure that someplace in the educational stream we are preparing our youth for those jobs, and let the industry help us. If you believe there's an active hotel business in this city, and there is, and people come here, and it's a great source of income and prosperity for this city, why not have the people who work in that industry prepared here rather than in Cornell School of Hotel Management? It just seems to make sense, and why not have the hotels tell us what kind of preparation they want? It doesn't seem to me like, pardon the expression, rocket science.
Let's move on to another question. This is from Eric Whitaker from the University of Chicago Medical Center. And in terms of partnerships with business, what are your thoughts on the movement to, quote unquote, venture philanthropy? How has this impacted MacArthur or not?
MacArthur, as other foundations do, makes grants in which there's a charitable purpose for the granting of money to some typically non-governmental organization, sometimes a governmental organization. We also do something that is a kind of a grant. It is called a program-related investment, and that may turn out in some cases to be a better vehicle to take advantage of a circumstance in which there is an incentive, financial incentive, for a grantee to perform. So what this can mean is if, for example, we are trying to create funding, capital for housing, the best way to do that may not be to make a grant, but may be to guarantee loans, to make money available in a program-related investment where there may be a return, actually, and in fact there should be an expectation that there will indeed be a return a below market rate return to the foundation so we can re-grant the money in some other way. But we will be taking advantage of if you will, in a kind of venture capital way, situations where there is a profit incentive in order to do the charitable objective of get that done. Housing is an area in which we have worked traditionally in Chicago in a very big way.
I'm going to combine two questions here from Leonard Dominguez and Calvin Holmes. Leonard from Educare Associates wants to know what are your concerns and what is MacArthur doing in the area of biodiversity? And then Calvin from the Chicago Community Loan Fund, I believe, says, how does the foundation measure if the world is becoming more verdant from your efforts? The verdant issue. So sort of both, where are you branching out in biodiversity and how are you measuring whether you're having an impact?
So when I came to the foundation, I found a very robust program in what we call conservation and sustainable development. It was principally focused on biodiversity, species preservation. And the strategy, which had been pursued at the foundation for about a decade, was sometimes called a hotspots strategy, where there was high endemism, where there's a lot of species diversity, and the idea was to preserve these areas from all kinds of forces, market forces, climate forces, and other forces, so that these hotspots would be kept intact and the species would be preserved. That strategy was emulated by other large groups, foundations and NGOs, and I can say this, I had nothing to do with designing this, it was before I came to the foundation, but the foundation was in the lead, cutting edge, in that kind of strategy. We did a review of this program for the last 10 years, found that it was successful. We would, with a check box, yes, we did, we want to do, we led people in this direction, but as we looked at what was evolving, we found that it was not adequate. So we have changed the locus of what we're doing. I would say rotated a bit to take account of the pressures which we are now seeing threatening biodiversity in a big way around the world, rather than focusing on small areas to just simply conserve or preserve. What we are now focusing on are much larger geographic areas that are under threat for destruction of species as a result of pressures of population, of resource extraction, particularly certain kinds of resource extraction methods, and from climate change. So it's preservation of whole watersheds in some cases, still looking of areas where there is a higher degree of endemism than not, and so that leads us to continue to work in Madagascar, which is a very interesting place in terms of the concentration of unique flora and fauna. We're in the Andes, we're in the Great Lakes region of East Africa, a bit in the Caribbean, and somewhat in the marine areas of the South Pacific and the Mekong. So it's still a global program. It is now more ambitious than it had been, and there is a clear political element to it, because you can't really act on these large areas without a kind of community development, which in South Chicago you'd be familiar with, of getting people aware of their rights so that they will preserve their own areas and their own way of living. It's political in that we need to impact the way countries, China in the lead, but other countries as well, extract resources. If we don't do something about that, then we'll have enormous problems with timber, with fish, and with other species flora and fauna we wish to preserve. And we need to impact the policies of countries. And that's harder to do than I think the strategy we had before. So, a redefined strategy, but still with the same kind of objective. How are we doing in preserving a verdant world? I can't say I think terribly well. This is not something that was in my background. As I you heard I did political military things mostly while I was, I think, an intelligent reader on this area. So I didn't really understand this until I went on the road and spending 9-10 days in Madagascar, 9-10 days in Ecuador, and looking at the way landscapes can be completely trashed, what the implications are of certain kinds of damming, what the implications are of certain kinds of extraction, are absolutely devastating. And this is a very big job. And there is an overlay to this, and that's climate change. And one can be completely taken up with the idea that we have to do something to reduce the rate at which we destroy the climate. You can also figure that you should put some effort in managing the consequences, which are now, to some degree, inevitable. I mean, even if we were to, all of us were to understand that we needed to do something about a carbon footprint, this is going to move on, and we need to deal with this in very real ways. So I think, for me, this is not a happy picture. It's a politically challenging one. Less people are concerned about this issue in the United States than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago, which is extraordinary, notwithstanding all the pictures of polar bears who are having trouble swimming from one little ice paddy to another one. It's still not quite working as a political issue in this country. Seriously needs to be reframed. We are way behind the rest of the world. We are an important player in this game, and that part needs to be addressed too.
I want to wrap up with one final question, and this kind of comes back to your comments about education and about building a kind of more robust citizenry in different ways. And from what I understand in terms of your vision of education, especially the role digital media can play, that these are tools that can give students, young people, a whole host of capacities, you know, to reason, to judge, to understand the difference between facts as they're presented or what they understand about how the world operates, skills that can be applied in any realm. And it seems that those are skills that could then be used to engage in public life and to try and change the course of politics. But what would you say to regular people gathered here today, if our job is to try and sort of change the directions of things? What would you counsel, what would you encourage people to go out and actually do or understand about the world, maybe, in order to start trying to create that change?
I'm not going to say write your congressman. I will say vote. I always think that's a good place to start.
Even in the midterms, the primaries.
I mean, let's go back, link that to an earlier question. I think the country's in serious trouble. I don't think it's irredeemable. We are, I don't know what it means to say we're the greatest country on the planet, but I do believe we have incredible resources, incredible capability. And, you know, it is, no one should short this country. But we have a lot of work to do, it seems, as citizens, and then depending on what particular area of life you happen to be living and where you work, there might be more or less you can do in this connection. But I think there's a lot of work for us to do, and there's some real basic things, and I start with education. As you said, the future always is youth. Right now we are not serving them well. I think our political system is malfunctioning in worse ways than it has in recent memory, and I think some effort at that would be useful. I think insisting on rational discourse and insisting on quality discussion of very complicated issues and being open to understanding and seeing other people's point of view would be a very good place to start.
Robert Gallucci, thank you so much.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you.